Welcome to the place where you'll hear from HR leaders, people experts, and wellbeing professionals. You'll learn about their personal and professional journeys, hear about the future of HR and wellbeing, and take away actionable insights and tips. This is the HR and Wellbeing Insider podcast. Are employee assistance programs worth their money? That's the golden question for HR and wellbeing leaders. Welcome to today's episode of the HR and Wellbeing podcast. I'm talking to a qualified psychotherapist with years of experience in EAP, on the front line, dealing with your people, your employees. James Sussex is a founder of Sust Therapy and will be talking to me today about his journey from the army into being a psychotherapist and all about workplace mental health and wellbeing. Tune in to find out more, and I'll see you on the other side. Welcome to the podcast, Jim. Great to have you on today.
Likewise. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, really glad to be with you.
Brilliant. Great. I think we should jump straight in, which is, why do you do what you do, and what actually inspired you to become a therapist and to focus on workplace mental health and wellbeing?
Well, it's been a long journey, and it's been one of hard work as well. So, I started off, my roots were in the army. I left home at 17 and I joined the army at 17 as well. And I remember kind of feeling a bit sort of lost at that time. I was living in a really rural area when I was 17, and I went to collect my my A-level results, or the AS level results, and at the same time I decided to go into the Army Careers Office. And before I knew it, I was away. I was off into basic training, and long story short, and it was there that I found that I really enjoyed working with people. So I worked in a people-facing role. I was supporting infantry soldiers in my role. I was in the Army for 5 years, and then I decided that, that I saw that the mental health infrastructure was not good at that time. So this was going back to sort of like 2009, 2010. And I decided that I really like working with people, really like supporting people. And I decided to enroll on a counselling certificate, basic certificate course at the weekends, which was still really difficult, having to pay people to do my guard duties and things like that so I could go home and do this course. And I just absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. I thought, this is it. This is where I need to be. I joined the army without finishing my A levels, and I didn't do a degree, and just basically just wanted to get away and get out there and see the world. And I did a bit of that at that time. And then going into the counselling, I really thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to commit. I felt ready to do that, and I enrolled on a degree. I signed off from the army, gave a year's notice, and then started my degree pretty much straight away. And I remember that I left the army in July 2013, and had a long weekend, and I started my civilian job on the Monday, and it was a huge transition. But all the way through, I just remember thinking, this is it. This is the mission. This is what I came to do. And just it's built from there. And I think, I remember being in training, and of course there's lots of hours that you have to do as part of the training, so on and so forth. And I remember asking the questions like, is there a corporate environment in which I can practice therapy? And I was having these conversations with my supervisor, who was a private supervisor. She said, well, have you never heard of employee assistance programs? And I said, no. And she said, well, an EAP is kind of like, it's the corporate side of life to therapy. And I started to look into it. I knew I wanted a private practice as well. And actually, it was the hierarchical structure that I needed coming from the military. And so that was my aim. That was my ultimate aim. And so, just really passionate about mental health, really passionate about mutual support, peer support, people helping people, and that was the basis of all of it.
Yeah. That's really exciting, actually. And starting out in the army, I suppose that wasn't easy. And then doing those, having to do those extra hours and learning. And you talked about there, the corporate side of mental health being an EAP. What roles have you done within EAP companies to date? And I know you have also got your own private practice as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I started off, I pretty much went straight away into EAP. I was looking at EAP roles. I qualified, applied for my very first role up in Sheffield, an EAP that no longer exists, but actually, that was my very first foray into it. So the first month out of training was targeted EAP focus. And I've had a sort of multitude of different clinical roles within EAP. So I'm on the clinical side of EAP. I've been a clinician in many different ways. So that includes helpline work and answering inbound calls from users of the service. Outbound clinician, I've done the ongoing work with the EAP. I've done critical incidents within the EAP and been a critical incident support. I've been on site with the EAPs, and then I've moved up into management sort of a few years ago now, so going back to about 2020, moved into a clinical team lead role and supported a very large team of clinicians. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. I've seen what I call the underbelly of EAP, those night shift clinical roles where it's all risk, fresh off the press, and I just imagined myself in a role where I was supporting clinicians. I could see that. And so that's what I aimed for next. That's how I got into that role, and then tried out a couple of different management roles, senior management role, and then eventually sort of interim clinical director role. All at the same time, I've had my private practice, which has grown and developed alongside that. And I'm now fully into that. I'm fully into my own business, so therapy. And that is almost like it takes an EAP approach with a difference. That's what I call it. So it's kind of like it's my own. Still working very closely with pretty much all the EAPs in the UK. But several key ones that I do trainings for, on-site mental health delivery and stuff like that.
Cool, really good. And in terms of your experience then, so you've been in the weeds at an EAP firm, on the clinical side. Very briefly, how would you describe an EAP to someone who's not heard of one before? Because in the market, EAPs are known for a lot of different things, which we'll touch on after this. But how would you describe an EAP to someone who's never heard of one before?
That's an interesting question because, I do a lot of orientation sessions for different EAPs when they want me to come and speak to what they do and how they are. And moving from my first to second EAP, I could see that the setup was quite similar. It's not just about the helpline. There are other themes to this. And I've kind of got this view on EAP where it is kind of like, if you imagine a sort of roof on a temple and it's held up by three different pillars, these marble pillars. And the roof on the temple is this wellness, the whole wellness approach. Okay, so it's well-being. But the first pillar is clinical, the second pillar is coaching, and the third pillar is advisory. So it's a whole well-being provider. An EAP is a whole well-being provider, often mistaken for just a helpline. Usually there's a lot more that's going on, but actually those threads of connection aren't necessarily there until we do these orientation sessions and people start to realize what it's actually all about. It's a really holistic way of working with mental health, and I think there's a huge benefit to them.
Really love that. I mean, that's not a description I've heard of an EAP before. Really, really love that. 3 key pillars, not just a helpline. And I think that the question to come now from me is, are EAPs worth their money? And if so, why?
I think yes. I think they are. And I think that, it's the reason why is that it's not about what you see on the surface. It's about the work that goes on at depth. And when we talk about depth, I'm talking about the work that clinicians are doing every day. I really see EAP as the forefront of mental health a lot of the time. Yes, EAP is a bit of a reactive kind of service. So we are picking up the slack where lots of different services are failing, quite frankly, failing. One of the worst cases I've ever heard of was somebody being on a waiting list for 2 years for something, whereas EAP turnaround times are usually no more than a week, for different things. So yeah, I think that EAP is absolutely worth the money, but I think the why is about understanding what's on offer and how it works. From my experience, I know that when there's a good setup within an EAP, and that means all departments working together for the same mission, you've got really, really hard work that's happening on the ground level, whether that is a coach, a clinician, an advisor, it could be somebody from an advisory team, all working together to provide that holistic view, that holistic mental health approach. And yes, it's absolutely worth the money because I don't think that people realize how much slack those team members are picking up. In every EAP I've worked in those kind of individual contributor roles, there's been times when I've handled 23, 24, 25 cases in a day, and it's advocacy all the time. You're thinking about the people that are on the end of the phone all the time. Now, from an individual contributor's point of view, you're not thinking about the business or the company under which the person's called in. You need to know what's available, but you're thinking about that person that's calling in, and that's invaluable. It really is invaluable because a lot of the time what we experience, what we see is that these folks have got nowhere else to go.
And that's important, isn't it? Because like you said, I mean, the NHS in the UK we know is under immense pressure. And actually people that are on these waiting lists, where do they go? And
Yeah,
at the end of the phone line, the clinicians at EAP firms, people like yourself, you are picking up the phone
yeah.
to people who are in need. So is there an argument to say if the EAPs weren't a thing, where do these people go? Because you've got organizations like Samaritans. I heard a stat that Samaritans had a tremendously long wait time to get through, whereas a lot of EAP firms, you can be speaking to a human being within a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of EAP, there's been a lot of rumors and myths about EAPs, particularly within the press and in the workplace wellbeing sector. What are the common myths and things that you've heard a bit about EAPs, from the front line that you just think actually that's not the case? Have you got any examples of that?
100%. The first one that comes to mind is corporate therapy. And I hate it when people say that EAP is corporate therapy. I can't stand it. Now, the thing is, I'm going to say this, Paul. EAP is, when we think about this is an actual term from family systems process, but EAP is the black sheep of the clinical world.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is that EAP gets a bit of a bad rep out there from other sort of corporate mental health and wellbeing providers. It also gets a bad rap in the clinical world amongst therapists and psychologists and whatnot. And I remember one time I was on a course and we had to share where we worked, what we did, and I shared about EAP and I was met with corporate therapy. And I'm thinking, no, it's just therapy. It's just therapy dressed up in a different way in terms of the organization. But because that corporate piece works, it really works. And so and I suppose, the connotations there or the attachments to that are, it's worthless, it's generic, it's not at any depth. The people don't care. EAP doesn't care. It's bringing in money. That's it. It's a money maker. And that's it, really. So it gets dismissed quite a lot.
It's not the case, is it? I mean, with EAPs, like you've talked about there, these people on the front line, it's really about helping people that are in need. How can a business actually measure the success of an EAP? Because, from my background, years ago, it was all around how many calls were made to an EAP, how quickly were those calls answered, what types of things did people want to talk to their EAP provider about when they did make that phone call? Was it debt? Was it family issues, etc.? But in a fast moving world, when we think about workplace mental health and well-being, how does a business that has an EAP, how do they really measure the effectiveness?
I think, my experience has been similar to yours, in seeing what, how we traditionally measure effectiveness of an EAP. But you've got to come back to the client. You've got to come back to the service user and their journey, their experience. One of the best things that I like to look into is kind of retention rate. How many people go from assessment to the service, to the actual utilization of the counselling sessions, let's say it's counselling sessions, and stay there and complete that course of treatment, and then getting their feedback on, actually, well, what was your experience of that journey? Did you feel comfortable to engage, so on, and what was the outcome for you? And we can use those clinical outcome measures to build a picture of that person's journey, the client journey. And I think that's really what we're talking about. We're looking at maybe follow up, changes in approach to the workplace, maybe that feeling of burnout, is it still there? And actually, coming back to all the time qualitative feedback.
Yeah, really
That's what I
important.
think.
And
Yeah.
and how do you link it with other benefits? So you do a lot of workplace mental health training for businesses.
Yeah.
So how do you link an EAP into those other benefits and services? Because there are other apps out there, mindfulness apps and different mental health and wellbeing apps. So when you've got an EAP, I think it's really important to make sure that it's integrated within a whole wellbeing strategy. How would you do that from your perspective on the clinical side? How do you really make sure an EAP is not out here on its own and is in with all the other benefits to actually make sure that it's linked to that training for managers, etc., and it gets used in the right way? What can businesses do you think?
I think be open and honest about what an EAP is, and that is that it can be more than what the myth says. It is more. It's a lot more than what the myth says. And when I do orientations, one of the first things I say is that I'm not here to sell you something because it's already sold. You've already got access I'm very careful not to call it a benefit. I try to change the language around it because I know that they've probably heard of it. It's been in their induction pack, or it's been at the HR orientation. Yes, we got this benefit for you. And I try to turn it into a language that people can connect with on the shop floor. If you've got a problem, we can help you with it. That is the bottom line here. You know, if it is, let's say, and I do give examples sometimes, but around divorce, for example, you know, this is a big one. It's a really common issue. We might not just be thinking about one thing. We might put together 4 different cases for that particular issue. It starts with the story, and it starts with a person-to-person conversation. Now, in this day and age, and we'll probably come on to this, but in this day and age, human-to-human conversation is much, much needed. And when people find out that there's another person on the end of that phone who is thinking about them, thinking about their story, their journey, and thinking about all these different theories and branch offs and what we have available as a team, we can really make it work for someone. That's advocacy. That is real advocacy. And it might be that we're thinking, okay, somebody's going through this divorce. They've slept in the car for the last week. Okay, financial pressures. Have they got any legal support? So we might do 4 things. Therapy sessions, housing, financial advice, legal advice. Boom. 4 cases, 4 things. Now we explain that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of value there. And actually, we haven't really touched on that yet, but people think that actually EAP is just a helpline, is counseling, but you've talked on those other areas, and actually having one human to human conversation, you've helped with the legal side, you've helped with that financial side, and EAPs, I don't think sometimes they do themselves justice and they don't talk about those other things. So what else does an EAP do outside of that therapy?
It's all about advocacy. So if we look at our 3 pillars, we've got the clinical, and the clinical is the counselling, but there's 4 or 5 things under every pillar. So with the counselling, you've got the in the moment support. Somebody rings, we're going to have a conversation. End of. We might go into an assessment. We might do the short-term sessions. We might need to leverage advocacy within that, and I will come back to that. The second pillar then is coaching, and there's usually some sort of life coaching available, career coaching, so on and so forth. It might be sort of mindfulness classes, things like this, self-learning style coaching, that sort of thing. The other side, the advisory pillar, is legal, financial, your daily living stuff, your day-to-day stuff. Now, every EAP has got some sort of variation of this. An EAP is also not a silo. And what I mean by that is that too often, and I think especially in the UK, too often services are siloed. And an EAP can really leverage support, really leverage. Now, I think there is a little bit of this reflected in the clinician, the counsellor, the therapist as well. I don't think that therapists speak up for themselves as much as they could do. But I know that every therapist I've worked with knows about this advocacy piece. They hold this person really close. And so we can come up with our own bespoke things. As a therapist, if I think that somebody could use an assessment, say, for autism, and it's been undiagnosed, I will write to the GP and I will say, I think this is what we need to do. If that person keeps going to the GP to ask for that, it's probably never going to happen. But because it's coming from me as a therapist and as a professional, it will happen. That's advocacy beyond the EAP. There have been times when people have been referred to me for short-term therapy, and it emerges there's a lot more going on than what the EAP can handle. But we can be part of that journey, and we can push that for that person. So we think about the limitations of our 3 pillars. We think about sometimes how we can utilize those 3 pillars. It's often that I get to the end of therapy with somebody and we've had our 6 to 10 sessions, let's say. Maybe the anxiety is reduced and let's say it's about work. Now there's scope for some coaching, some career coaching, and we can tag that on to the end. So we've got a really bespoke service that we can create from what's available, if that makes sense.
Yeah, really, really good answer, really informative. And you've talked about advocacy quite a bit, actually. So from a corporate setting, how does a HR and wellbeing team really promote advocacy when it comes to mental health in the workplace? Because I think that's different to just pushing employee benefits on people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, I've had a great reception in orientations. I think, over the last probably 12 months, I've done a lot of EAP orientations, not just for staff members, but for managers and senior managers as well. And they don't realize that it all comes back to just a conversation. Trust in the person on the end of the phone. Give us the autonomy to flex our clinical muscle because we know what we're doing. and we know what we're talking about. And so what we come back to at the end of an orientation is you don't need to remember anything I've said today, because we're going to walk you through it when you come into the service. And so it's trust. And for folks in HR and people that are looking after well-being, it's important to repeat that message. Trust in the EAP, trust in the people that are on the front line of that work, because they're often very highly skilled. The important factor in that for an EAP is to extend trust to your people, because they know what they're doing. Extend that autonomy. Let them work with that autonomy, because we are trained to think and to feel. And so we're not thinking about anything else apart from that person, the story, and what we might be able to do. That makes sense.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. And you say you're trained, you've got, you want to flex your clinical muscle. You talked about human to human connection and conversation, which is really important. There's a lot of talk about AI, generally speaking. There's a lot of talk around AI in mental health and chatbots and triage. How do you see AI and technology fitting in with this sort of workplace mental health and well-being? And are robots going to be the answer?
Integration, I think, is going to be where it needs to go. At the moment, AI is trendy. It's new and it's doing a great job. I think it's doing a great job. I would advocate for AI. AI has helped me with my own project management and stuff like that at times, which has just been so useful. And now I can operate like an octopus, and kind of do many things at different times. But
Yeah.
it's not the answer. It's an option. It's an
Yeah.
option. And I think with triage coming into services, integration of AI into business, absolutely, it's an edge. And we shouldn't be afraid to use that edge. But at the same time, the golden nugget of the future, because of all of that, is going to be human to human connection. And I think a good EAP will have both available and see the value in both. So I think integration is the way it's going to go eventually. Right now, there's a big swing to AI, and that's great. But integration, I think, is where it's going to land.
Yeah. I mean, you've put that beautifully and very simple. I think integration is absolutely the way to go. I would certainly say from my experience, I don't think I'd be wanting to receive counseling from a chatbot, but that triage, the admin process to get me more time with a human. Absolutely. So love that. And you did a great post on LinkedIn actually last week, and it was all around leadership, management, and the conversations that you're having, sus therapy there, and who actually looks after the managers, the leaders, who protects them, where do they get their support? Now, we've talked about EAP, and that's generally speaking for the masses, for the employees. Why is mental health training important for management and senior leaders within a business?
Well, firstly, the pressure that's out there these days, especially in a post-COVID environment. And we're now 5 years post-COVID, and we keep talking about COVID. It happened. This thing happened, and it kind of changed the way that we do things. Mental health pressures. I mean, just to give you a bit of an example, I was working overnight at an EAP during COVID. The night that things went into lockdown, the calls changed. It was a massive trend shift amongst peers. We were talking about things have really intensified. The calls that we're getting. And the thing is, it hasn't gone back. I've always said through COVID, there's no going back. And I did a webinar probably about 4 years ago where we talked about exactly that. Things haven't gone back. That intensity in the clinical presentations has stayed. It's stayed. And so the demand is still there. And so, I think the importance of training for managers is around recognizing that there is more strain now on managers, especially middle managers. They are taking the brunt of everything. Lots of mental health issues in teams, lots more diagnoses that are out there, sometimes on the sort of high end of things. So we're talking personality disorders, etc., and so on. But depression and anxiety through the roof, absolutely through the roof. And there's a lot that's happening still globally. You could kind of argue that since COVID, things have kind of just got worse in many ways. And it's impacting folks, it's impacting people, but it's impacting managers who are managing all of that and trying to do their day-to-day job at the same time. And it's middle managers. Senior managers are kind of off over there and, looking after services and so on and so forth. Middle managers are in the trenches with everybody else. And that's why it gets really hot really quick for middle managers. Now, a lot of the trainings that I saw coming out around COVID time were how to support your team, how to identify mental health issues. What about you? Where are you going to go? And I just think behind every leader, there is another title, and that is just human being. And it's so, so simple a philosophy. And, I work from all levels, from sort of shop floor all the way up to C-suite people, and it's like everybody's got the same concerns,
Yeah.
similar
And I think
concerns. Yeah.
I would agree. I think managers have a lot of pressure on, particularly middle management, where they've got pressure from the top and pressure from below. And actually, there is a lot more awareness around different things now: depression, anxiety, autism, ADHD, etc. So we totally agree. To finish our session today, it'd be really great just to get, what is that one or two pieces of advice that you would give to HR and wellbeing leaders when it comes to workplace mental health and training and support? What's one thing that you say, to your contacts when it comes to that in a workplace?
I think, it's around that perk piece. Wellbeing is not a perk. It is real. It's a real issue. If we don't take care of our dimensions of well-being, whether we are somebody that works on the shop floor, HR person, a well-being leader, or a C-suite leader, if we don't take care of well-being and mental health, things get bad really quick. Now, that's where we can make the switch from an EAP being something reactive to proactive. And I think the future of integration as well is about proactive mental health, not just reactive.
Yeah. And I think that's really key, isn't it? I think reactive is only good to a point. And I think when it comes to mental health and wellbeing, it really is about being proactive and having that reactive piece there as well. Really good session today, Jim. Really appreciate your time. Loads of value. Really good to understand the other side of an EAP. And actually, from a clinician perspective, I will link your private practice in the show notes, share your LinkedIn profile as well. But it's been great having you on today. Really, really appreciate your time.
Excellent. Likewise. Thanks, Paul. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the HR and Wellbeing Insider podcast. Look out for the next episode, and in the meantime, sign up to our newsletter in the comments below to hear more from our guests and news and tips on HR and wellbeing. See you in the next episode.